Dropping deeper into the indigo black, the submersible's powerful beams illuminate a stunning array of life hidden in the tranquil depths.
Look at the mantle length on that one. It's significantly larger than the previous sighting.
Confirmed. I'm logging the coordinates now. The movement seems incredibly calm.
The legend of the Kraken had long haunted the dreams of sailors, a colossal beast lurking in the abyssal depths. Weighing up to 45 tons, the sperm whale navigates these deep blue waters, a serene silhouette in the
For thousands of years, sailors have returned from the ocean with the same terrifying warning: something is moving beneath the ship. They spoke of enormous tentacles rising from black water, whirlpools swallowing entire vessels, voices that could lure crews toward their deaths, and serpents so enormous they were said to wrap around the world. We call them myths. But here's the disturbing part. Some of these monsters were inspired by real animals and real phenomena. The Kraken may have been born from encounters with giant squid. Charybdis was connected to dangerous ocean currents. And sailors really did encounter creatures so strange that they had no idea what they were looking at. And the deeper we explore the ocean today, the more we realize how little we actually know. So what if the ancient stories weren't completely wrong? What if behind some of history's most terrifying sea monsters was a creature, a natural phenomenon, or a mystery that people simply didn't have the science to explain? Tonight, we're going beneath the surface to uncover the terrifying sea monsters that may have had a real story behind them. When the ocean became a monster. For most of human history, the ocean was a giant question mark. People could see the horizon, but they couldn't see what was beneath it. They didn't have sonar. They didn't have submarines. They couldn't map the deep sea or track what was moving hundreds or thousands of feet below a wooden ship. To a sailor crossing the North Atlantic centuries ago, the ocean could become terrifying in an instant. The wind could disappear. The waves could suddenly change. A fog could swallow the horizon. And beneath the ship, something enormous could be moving without making a sound. That fear gave birth to one of the most famous monsters in history. The Kraken. For generations, Scandinavian sailors told stories of a creature so enormous that it could be mistaken for an island. Imagine sailing across open water when the sea around you suddenly becomes strangely calm. Then the water beneath the ship begins to darken. At first, you might think it's a patch of deep water. Then something rises. A tentacle breaks the surface. Then another. Then another. Long arms covered in powerful suckers begin wrapping around the vessel. The crew has nowhere to run. The creature pulls. The ship tilts. Wood cracks. And slowly, the entire vessel disappears beneath the waves. That was the nightmare of the Kraken. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because there really is an animal that lives deep beneath the ocean with enormous tentacles. The giant squid. For centuries, scientists knew these animals existed mostly because pieces of them occasionally appeared in the stomachs of whales or washed onto beaches. Then actual specimens began turning up. The giant squid was no longer just a sailor's story. It was real. Some specimens have reached lengths of more than 10 meters, making them one of the largest invertebrates ever discovered. And they live in an environment humans almost never see directly. The deep ocean. Dark. Cold. Under enormous pressure. We now know that giant squid have huge eyes, powerful tentacles and a body built for life in darkness. But there is still something scientists don't completely know. How large can these animals become in the wild? Most of the specimens we've studied were found dead or near the surface. We still have limited observations of healthy giant squid living naturally in the deepest parts of the ocean. So no, we haven't discovered a monster capable of wrapping its tentacles around a warship. But the discovery of the giant squid changed the way people looked at the Kraken. The monster wasn't completely imaginary anymore. Something resembling it actually existed. And that wasn't the only ancient sea monster connected to a real danger. Thousands of years ago, Greek sailors feared a narrow stretch of water between Italy and Sicily. They believed two monsters controlled the passage. One was Scylla. The other was Charybdis. According to the mythology, Scylla lived among the rocks. She was described as a terrifying creature with multiple heads and a body surrounded by monstrous limbs. Ships passing too close could lose sailors in seconds. But the real danger was what waited on the opposite side. Charybdis. Unlike Scylla, Charybdis wasn't described as a creature standing on the rocks. She was the sea itself. A massive vortex that could pull water downward and swallow ships. For an ancient sailor, that must have looked like something alive. Imagine watching the ocean begin to rotate. The current becomes stronger. The surface sinks. The ship starts drifting toward the center. You pull the sails. You fight the current. But the water keeps dragging you closer. You wouldn't need to invent a monster. You would already feel like one was trying to eat you. And here's the fascinating part. The Strait of Messina, the region associated with these legends, really does experience powerful tidal currents and whirlpools. Modern science can explain them. Ancient sailors couldn't. They didn't understand tidal dynamics or underwater currents. So they gave the danger a name. Charybdis. A monster beneath the water that inhaled the sea. The story of Scylla and Charybdis eventually became part of Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus is forced to choose between two terrible dangers. And that's what makes the legend so powerful. It wasn't really about defeating the monster. It was about surviving the ocean. Sometimes there was no perfect choice. Go one direction and you could lose several men. Go the other direction and the entire ship could disappear. For ancient sailors, the sea wasn't an empty space between countries. It was an unpredictable world of its own. A world where strange sounds could come from nowhere. Where enormous animals could appear beside a ship. Where whirlpools could form without warning. And where the darkness beneath the hull could hide almost anything. The Kraken may have been exaggerated. Scylla may have been mythology. Charybdis may have been a natural phenomenon given a personality. But together, they reveal something important about the people who told these stories. They weren't simply afraid of imaginary monsters. They were trying to understand a real environment that was far more powerful than they were. And the deeper humanity traveled into the ocean, the stranger the stories became. Because the next monster didn't attack ships with tentacles. It attacked something much more dangerous. The human mind. Part 2, The Monsters that Lived Between Myth and Reality. But not every sea monster needed claws, tentacles, or enormous teeth. Some were far more dangerous because they could make sailors destroy themselves. One of the most famous examples came from ancient Greece. The sirens. Today, many people imagine sirens as beautiful mermaids sitting on rocks, singing to passing sailors. But that image came much later. In the oldest Greek stories, the sirens were described as strange creatures with the bodies or features of birds and the faces of women. Their real weapon wasn't physical strength. It was their voice. Their song was supposedly so beautiful that sailors couldn't resist it. A ship would hear the music from somewhere beyond the waves. The crew would become obsessed. They would change direction. They would sail toward the sound. And eventually, the ship would crash against the rocks. The sirens didn't need to chase anyone. They simply waited. One of the most famous sailors to face them was Odysseus. He wanted to hear their song. But he also knew exactly what would happen if he listened without protection. So he came up with a plan. He ordered his crew to fill their ears with wax. Then he had himself tied tightly to the ship's mast. He gave his men strict instructions. No matter what he said, they were not allowed to release him. As the ship approached the sirens, the singing began. Odysseus heard it. And according to the story, he immediately wanted to go toward them. He shouted at his crew. He demanded to be released. He struggled against the ropes. But his sailors kept rowing. They didn't listen to him. Eventually, the ship moved beyond the danger. Odysseus became one of the only people in the ancient stories to hear the sirens and survive. It's a powerful myth. But there may be something hidden behind it. Ancient sailors often traveled near unfamiliar islands and dangerous coastlines. Sound can travel surprisingly far across calm water. A strange animal call, human voices, wind passing through rocks, or even echoes could become distorted across the sea. A sailor who didn't understand where a sound was coming from might create a story around it. And if ships repeatedly disappeared near a dangerous coastline, the story could become even more terrifying. The sirens may never have existed. But the danger of sailing towards something you couldn't see absolutely did. Then we encounter another legendary creature. Cetus. In Greek mythology, Cetus was a gigantic sea monster sent against a kingdom. The creature was so terrifying that a princess named Andromeda was chained to a rock as a sacrifice. The monster came toward her. But before it could reach her, a hero named Perseus appeared. Perseus had recently defeated Medusa. He used Medusa's severed head against the creature. Cetus was turned to stone. The story eventually became part of the stars. Today, Cetus is one of the largest constellations in the night sky. But what inspired the ancient image of a gigantic sea beast? That question is harder to answer. The Mediterranean has always contained large marine animals. Whales occasionally appear near coastlines. Large sharks live in the region. Giant fish and unfamiliar creatures can look completely alien when seen for the first time. And then there are dead animals. This matters because a decomposing whale can look absolutely bizarre. Imagine an ancient fisherman discovering a huge carcass on a beach. He has never seen a whale alive. He doesn't know what species it belongs to. He doesn't understand decomposition. All he knows is that something enormous has washed ashore. That single discovery could become the beginning of a monster story. And stories like this continued long after the ancient world disappeared. During the medieval period, European sailors told stories of a creature called the Aspidocalone. The legend described something that looked like an island floating in the ocean. It was flat. It was still. Sometimes vegetation appeared to grow across its surface. Exhausted sailors would see it and think they had finally found land. So they would stop. They would climb onto it. They would light fires. They would cook food. They would celebrate. Then the island would move. The ground beneath them wasn't land. It was the back of an enormous creature. And when the creature dove beneath the water, the sailors suddenly realized their mistake. At first glance, the story sounds completely impossible. But consider what a whale might look like from a small wooden boat. A huge whale resting near the surface can expose only part of its back. From a distance, it could look like a rock. If the animal remained still long enough, seaweed and birds could gather around it. A tired sailor might genuinely mistake it for a piece of land. The myth obviously exaggerates the scale. But the original observation may have been based on something real. And this pattern appears again and again throughout history. People saw something unusual. They didn't have the scientific knowledge to identify it. The story grew. The details became more dramatic. And eventually, a real animal or natural phenomenon transformed into a monster. Then there is the Bakunawa, a legendary serpent from the Philippines. According to traditional stories, the Bakunawa lived in the sea and tried to swallow the moon. Ancient people believed that eclipses happened because this enormous serpent had reached the sky. When the moon began disappearing, villagers would make as much noise as possible. They would bang drums. They would shout. They would strike metal objects. They believed the noise would frighten the creature away. And then something remarkable happened. The moon returned. Today, we know exactly why. The Earth had moved between the sun and the moon, casting a shadow across the lunar surface. But imagine watching that happen without understanding astronomy. The moon slowly disappears. The world becomes darker. People scream and make noise. Then the moon returns. From their perspective, the evidence was obvious. The monster had attacked. And they had scared it away. The story may sound primitive to us. But it reveals something deeply human. When people encounter something they cannot explain, they create a story that makes the mystery understandable. Sometimes that story becomes mythology. Sometimes it becomes religion. And sometimes, centuries later, science discovers that there was a real phenomenon hiding underneath the legend. But some ancient monsters weren't created to explain an animal. They were created to represent something much bigger. The uncontrollable power of the ocean itself. And that's where the story of Leviathan begins. Part 3, The Monsters That Ruled the Deep. If the Kraken represented the fear of what might be beneath a ship, Leviathan represented something even bigger. The idea that there are forces in nature that humanity was never meant to control. In the Hebrew scriptures, Leviathan is described as a creature of enormous power. Its body is protected by overlapping scales. Weapons are useless against it. The sea churns around it. And human beings are warned that confronting such a creature would be foolish. But Leviathan was more than a giant animal. It became a symbol of chaos itself. Something ancient. Something powerful. Something that existed long before humans arrived and would remain long after they were gone. And that idea appears in another ancient civilization. Thousands of years ago, Babylonian storytellers described a primordial being called Tiamat. Tiamat wasn't simply a monster living in the sea. She was the ancient saltwater ocean itself. According to the Babylonian creation story, Tiamat helped give birth to the earliest gods. But eventually, conflict erupted between the older and younger generations of gods. Tiamat became their enemy. And she prepared for war. Her army was not made of ordinary soldiers. It was filled with terrifying creatures. Serpents. Dragons. Scorpion-like beings. Monsters designed to inspire fear. At the center of it all was Tiamat herself. A gigantic force of chaos. The young god Marduk agreed to face her. But he demanded something in return. If he defeated Tiamat, the other gods would recognize him as their supreme ruler. The battle began. Tiamat attacked. Marduk fought back. Then he used the wind against her, forcing it into her body and preventing her from closing her mouth. He raised his weapon. And killed her. But the story didn't end with her death. Marduk took Tiamat's enormous body and divided it. One part became the heavens. The other became the earth. Her eyes became the sources of great rivers. In this ancient Babylonian worldview, the world wasn't simply created from nothing. It was created from the remains of a defeated sea monster. Think about how strange that idea is. The ground beneath your feet. The sky above you. The rivers flowing across the land. All of it was imagined as the transformed body of something that once ruled the primordial ocean. And then, thousands of miles away, another civilization imagined a creature so enormous that its body could surround the entire world. The Norse called it Jormungandr. The world serpent. According to Norse mythology, Jormungandr was one of the children of Loki. The gods feared what it could become. So they threw the serpent into the ocean surrounding Midgard, the world of humans. But instead of dying, it grew. And grew. Until it became so enormous that it completely encircled the world. Its body stretched around Midgard. Its tail reached its mouth. And there it remained beneath the ocean, waiting. For the Norse, this wasn't simply a monster. It was part of the fate of the world. One day, during Ragnarok, the serpent would release its tail. And when it did, disaster would follow. The oceans would rise. Waves would crash across the land. Jormungandr would emerge from the depths and face its greatest enemy. Thor. The god of thunder had encountered the serpent before. But Ragnarok would be different. This time, there would be no escape. Thor would strike Jormungandr with his hammer. The serpent would finally fall. But its final attack would be deadly. Venom would poison Thor. The god would walk away from the battle, only to collapse shortly afterward. The monster would die. But so would its killer. And that is the strange pattern connecting almost every great sea monster in human history. The monster is rarely just a monster. The Kraken represents the fear of the unknown. Scylla represents impossible choices. Charybdis represents nature's uncontrollable power. The sirens represent temptation. Leviathan represents chaos. Tiamat represents the primordial ocean. And Jormungandr represents destruction waiting beneath the surface. But here's where these stories become relevant to us. For centuries, humans believed the deep ocean was almost completely empty. Then science started looking closer. We discovered giant squid. Animals that create their own light. Fish living under crushing pressure. Creatures that survive in complete darkness. Entire ecosystems around hydrothermal vents. Species that look so strange they could have been designed for a monster movie. And we're still discovering new life. The deepest parts of the ocean remain difficult to explore. We have mapped much of the seafloor, but mapping something isn't the same as actually seeing everything that lives there. There are enormous regions where humans have never directly observed the animals living in the darkness. And that leaves us with an uncomfortable question. What if some ancient sailors really did see something extraordinary? Maybe they saw a giant squid and imagined the Kraken. Maybe they watched a deadly whirlpool and imagined Charybdis. Maybe a whale surfaced beside their ship and became a sea serpent. Maybe a strange carcass washed onto a beach and became evidence of a monster. Or maybe some stories began with nothing more than fear. We may never know. But there is one thing we can say with certainty. The ocean has always been bigger than our understanding of it. Ancient sailors looked into the darkness and filled it with monsters. Modern humans look into the same darkness with submarines, cameras, sonar, and scientific instruments. And yet, every time we explore deeper, we find something unexpected. So perhaps the most frightening sea monster isn't the Kraken. It isn't Leviathan. It isn't the world serpent. It's the part of the ocean we still haven't seen. Because mythology once told us that monsters were hiding beneath the waves. Science proved that some of the creatures were real. And the deeper we go, the harder it becomes to say where the myth ends and the unknown begins.